Every analyst covering the Middle East is telling you what might happen. Almost none of them are telling you when it happens, in what sequence, and why that sequence matters more than any individual event within it. Because the most dangerous thing about a regional war is not the first strike. It is the chain of events that the first strike sets into motion. The escalation logic, the response timelines, the decision windows that open and close within hours, and the points at which the war either expands beyond control or finds a ceiling that contains it. That sequence, day 1 to day 30, is the story no one is walking you through. And it is the story that determines whether this conflict becomes a contained exchange or the most consequential regional war since 1973. Before we go any further, if this kind of detailed, structural, ahead-of-the-curve analysis is what you have been missing, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because mapping the logic of what happens next, before it happens, is exactly what this channel is built to deliver. In this video, we're going to answer 3 questions. What does the actual day-by-day escalation sequence look like from the moment a major triggering event occurs? Who moves first, what they hit, how the other side responds, and how fast the decisions have to be made? What are the structural factors, military, political, economic, and diplomatic, that determine whether each day's events push the conflict toward expansion or toward a ceiling? And what does the 30-day mark look like? What is the state of the region, the state of American domestic politics, the state of global energy markets, and the state of the broader international order at the point where the initial shock has settled and the longer strategic competition truly begins? Let's build this timeline carefully and precisely, because the logic of each phase determines the logic of the next. First, the context that makes this timeline analysis necessary right now rather than theoretical. The Middle East has been operating in what strategists call a pre-war environment for the better part of 2 years, a condition in which the structural conditions for a major escalation are present, the triggering events are plausible and in some cases imminent, but the actual crossing of the threshold into declared large-scale direct interstate conflict has not yet occurred. Pre-war environments are inherently unstable. They do not resolve themselves through inertia. They resolve through one of 2 mechanisms, either a diplomatic process that changes the structural conditions sufficiently to reduce the escalation risk, or a triggering event that crosses the threshold and activates the escalation sequence. The current diplomatic environment, the state of US-Iran relations, the state of Israeli-Lebanese relations, the state of the broader regional political architecture, does not present the conditions for the first mechanism to operate effectively in the near term, which means the probability that the second mechanism, the triggering event, determines how this pre-war environment resolves is higher than at any point in recent memory. The media narrative tells you this is a situation of dangerous but manageable tension, that the parties involved understand the escalation risks well enough to keep pulling back from the edge. The structural reality tells you something more sobering. The escalation logic of the current military postures, the proxy network activation levels, and the domestic political pressures operating on the key decision makers has created a situation in which the triggering event does not need to be chosen. It can happen through miscalculation, through a decision made at a level below strategic leadership, through a technical failure, or through a proxy group action that its Iranian patron did not fully authorize. The war timeline we are about to walk through is not a prediction that this war will happen on a specific date. It is a map of the sequence that activates once the threshold is crossed, regardless of the specific event that crosses it. Now let's walk through the timeline, phase by phase, with the precision this analysis requires. Day 1 begins not with the first explosion, but with the first strategic decision. Whatever the triggering event, an Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear infrastructure, an Iranian proxy attack that kills American service members at a scale that crosses the political threshold, a direct Iranian strike on an American or Israeli asset that removes any ambiguity about attribution, the first hours of day 1 are defined not by military action, but by the decision cycles of the major actors. And those decision cycles operate on very different timelines, which is the first critical structural fact of the entire 30-day sequence. The American decision cycle on day 1 is the slowest of the major actors. The president must be briefed. The National Security Council convenes. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs presents military options. Intelligence assessments are evaluated for attribution confidence. Legal counsel weighs in on authorization. Congressional leadership is notified, not for authorization, which takes longer, but for the political management of the domestic response. Allied consultations are initiated, Israel, the Gulf states, NATO partners, because American military action without at least the appearance of Allied coordination creates political vulnerabilities that the administration needs to manage. This process in an extreme crisis can move in hours rather than days, but it cannot move in minutes. And in the first hours of day one, minutes matter in ways that the American decision cycle is structurally unable to address. Iran's decision cycle on day one is faster for one specific reason. Its response options have been pre-planned, pre-positioned, and pre-authorized at a level of operational detail that does not require the kind of deliberative process the American system mandates. The IRGC has maintained what military planners call pre-delegated authority, the authorization for specific response packages that can be activated by field commanders within defined parameters without requiring direct authorization from Tehran in the moment. This is not a guess. It is the operational lesson Iran drew from the killing of Qasem Soleimani, which demonstrated the vulnerability of requiring senior leadership to be in the decision loop for time-sensitive responses. The result is that on day one, while the American national security apparatus is working through its deliberative process, Iranian response packages are already activating. Not necessarily the full response, but the initial elements of a pre-planned sequence that is designed to present the United States with a set of simultaneous problems before the American decision cycle has completed its first iteration. Israel's decision cycle on day one is the most situationally dependent of the three. If Israel is the initiating actor, if the triggering event is an Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear or military infrastructure, then the Israeli decision cycle has already completed before day one begins. The strike has been planned, rehearsed, and executed with the kind of operational precision that months or years of preparation enable. If Israel is a responding actor, if the triggering event is an Iranian or proxy attack on Israeli territory or assets, then the Israeli decision cycle is faster than the American cycle, but operating under a different set of constraints, particularly around the management of the American relationship and the need to coordinate sufficiently to ensure American air defense support is available for the Iranian response that will follow within hours. By the end of day one, the following has occurred in the most likely escalation scenario. The triggering event has been publicly attributed, either by the initiating actor claiming the action or by independent intelligence confirming attribution. The initial Iranian response packages have activated, almost certainly including an immediate uptick in proxy activity across multiple fronts simultaneously, a public statement from the supreme leader that frames the conflict in terms designed to maximize regional and international political support for Iran's position, and the positioning of Iranian naval and missile assets in configurations that signal readiness for the next phase of response. The American military has moved to heightened alert posture across all regional installations. The United Nations Security Council has been convened for an emergency session that will produce no binding resolution because China and Russia will veto any resolution that constrains Iranian response options. Global oil markets have opened to the largest single-day price movement since the 2008 financial crisis. Days 2 through 4 represent the most dangerous window of the entire 30-day sequence. This is the period in which the conflict is either contained at the level of the initial exchange or expands into something categorically larger. The danger of this window is specific and structural. It is the period in which military response logic is operating faster than diplomatic management logic, and in which the pre-delegated response packages on all sides are executing according to pre-war plans that were designed for a strategic environment that may have already been overtaken by events. On day 2, the Iranian proxy network activates at a level above its pre-conflict operational tempo. Hezbollah begins rocket and missile fire into northern Israel. Not the full arsenal, not yet, but enough to force Israeli air defense systems into high operational tempo and begin the munitions consumption that is one of the strategic objectives of the opening phase. Houthi missile and drone launches in the Red Sea intensify, targeting both commercial shipping and American naval assets. Iraqi militia attacks on American bases in Iraq and Syria increase in frequency and in the scale of the munitions used. Each of these actions is individually deniable as an independent decision by an independent actor. Together, they constitute the opening phase of the integrated response that Iran's operational concept requires. On day 3, the United States faces its first major decision branch of the conflict. The proxy escalation on day 2 has produced casualties. American service members killed in Iraq, significant damage to an American naval asset in the Red Sea, Israeli civilian casualties from Hezbollah rocket fire. The American decision cycle has now completed its first iteration, and the president faces a menu of military options that range from targeted strikes on specific proxy infrastructure to a broader campaign that includes strikes on Iranian territory. The political pressure for a robust response is enormous. The strategic argument for restraint, avoiding the expansion that Iranian operational planning is designed to provoke, is sound, but politically difficult to execute in an environment where American casualties are visible and domestic political actors are demanding accountability. This decision point on day 3 is the most consequential single decision of the entire 30-day sequence, and it is worth dwelling on precisely because it is the decision point that most directly determines whether the conflict finds a ceiling or continues expanding. If the American response on days 3 and 4 is confined to proxy infrastructure, strikes on Hezbollah weapons storage, Houthi launch sites, Iraqi militia command and control, the conflict has a path toward a ceiling at a level of intensity that is damaging and costly, but does not trigger the full Iranian escalation sequence. If the American response includes strikes on Iranian territory, even strikes on Iranian military assets, not on civilian infrastructure, not on nuclear facilities, it crosses a threshold that activates pre-planned Iranian responses that are qualitatively different from the proxy escalation of day 2. Days 5 through 7 see the conflict's character become defined regardless of which decision branch day 3 produces. If the ceiling path has been chosen, proxy-focused American response, Iran is managing a choice between accepting the ceiling, which it can frame domestically as a measured response that demonstrated Iranian deterrence capability, or escalating to force the direct confrontation its operational planning has prepared for. The domestic political pressure within Iran, from the IRGC, from hardline factions, to escalate rather than accept a ceiling that limits Iranian strategic gains is significant. The supreme leader's decision in this window is the Iranian equivalent of the American Day 3 decision, the most consequential choice of the entire sequence. If the escalation path has been chosen, American strikes on Iranian territory, the IRGC's pre-delegated response packages for direct confrontation activate. Iranian ballistic missiles are launched at American bases in the region. The volume is sufficient to saturate point defense at multiple installations simultaneously. American casualties rise to a level that the domestic political environment transforms into a mandate for escalation rather than de-escalation. Days 8 through 14 constitute what military planners call the operational phase, the period in which both sides are executing their pre-planned military campaigns at significant scale. For the United States and Israel, this means sustained air operations against Iranian military infrastructure, air defense suppression to create operational space for subsequent strikes, naval operations to manage the Strait of Hormuz threat, and the beginning of the campaign against Iranian missile launch capacity that is the highest military priority of the entire operation. For Iran, this means the sustained multi-front proxy pressure, designed to maximize American and Israeli resource consumption across simultaneous theaters, combined with ballistic missile operations against American regional installations and whatever remains of its air defense network against American and Israeli air power. The critical structural development of days 8 through 14 is the economic shock that is now fully registered in global markets. Oil has crossed $150 per barrel by day 8 in the most likely escalation scenario involving Strait of Hormuz disruption. By day 12, depending on the physical state of Gulf energy infrastructure, it is approaching $180. Every government in the world with significant oil import dependence, which is essentially every major economy including China, is now managing an economic crisis on top of a security crisis. The political pressure this generates on every actor in the conflict is significant. For the United States, it intensifies domestic political pressure to end the conflict rapidly, which works against the strategic patience required to achieve the military objectives of the campaign. For Iran, the economic pressure is partly offset by the fact that it is an oil producer that benefits from elevated prices and partly compounded by the disruption to its own economic functioning that the military campaign is producing. For China, it is an unambiguous economic negative that begins to shift Beijing's calculus from passive enabler of Iranian strategy toward active participant in pressure for a ceasefire framework. Days 15 through 20 represent the first genuine opening for diplomatic management of the conflict. By day 15, all the major actors have a clearer picture of what the conflict is actually costing them, and a better assessment of what their military actions are and are not achieving. The United States has achieved significant damage to Iranian military infrastructure, but has not fundamentally altered the operational capacity of the proxy network or resolved the Strait disruption. Iran has imposed significant costs on American regional assets and on Israeli civilian and military infrastructure, but has not achieved the kind of decisive blow that forces American strategic withdrawal. Both sides are operating in a zone of costly stalemate, expensive enough that continuation requires political justification, unclear enough in terms of military outcome that neither side can credibly claim victory. This is the window in which back-channel diplomacy intensifies. The Qatari channel, which has historically been the primary back channel between Washington and Tehran, activates at higher tempo. The Omani channel, which has played a similar role in previous crisis periods, becomes active. Chinese diplomacy, motivated by the oil price shock that is damaging the Chinese economy, moves from the sidelines toward active engagement and pressure for a framework. Russian diplomatic activity, complicated by its own conflict and sanctions situation, is less constructive but present. The parameters of a possible framework begin to take shape. A ceasefire that both sides can present as a measured pause, a commitment to a diplomatic process that addresses the fundamental issues, and a managed de-escalation of proxy activity in exchange for some relaxation of the pressure that has been driving the cycle. Days 21 through 25 are the ceasefire negotiation window, the period in which the diplomatic framework that days 15 through 20 identified is either translated into an actual agreement or collapses under the weight of the domestic political pressures operating on the decision-makers who would need to sign it. The American domestic political environment at day 21 is deeply conflicted. The public that wanted a robust response to the initial triggering event is now also seeing the economic consequences of the conflict. The gas prices, the market decline, the cost estimates for the military operations, and the political coalition that supported robust action is fracturing along exactly the lines that Iranian strategic planning anticipated. Congressional pressure for a resolution is building from both sides of the political spectrum. From the hawks, who believe the campaign is not being executed with sufficient decisiveness to achieve its objectives, and from the doves, who believe the costs are exceeding any achievable benefit. The Iranian domestic political environment at day 21 is more consolidated than the American environment. War tends to consolidate political support for an incumbent government in ways that democracies do not experience to the same degree. But the economic damage of the military campaign, combined with the ongoing costs of the proxy network activation, is creating resource pressures that limit the operational tempo the IRGC can sustain indefinitely. The supreme leader is receiving advice from the pragmatic faction of the regime, the economic managers, and the diplomatic professionals, that a ceasefire framework that preserves Iran's core strategic gains is superior to continued escalation that risks the military destruction of capabilities that took decades to build. Days 26 through 30 are the consolidation window, the period in which the ceasefire framework either holds and begins the transition to a longer diplomatic process, or fractures and returns the conflict to the operational phase, with both sides operating on depleted resources and heightened animosity. The structural factors that determine which of these outcomes prevails are specific and observable. On the American side, whether the domestic political coalition can sustain the ceasefire despite the absence of a clear military victory narrative. On the Iranian side, whether the IRGC can accept the operational constraints that a ceasefire requires without the kind of proxy activity that undermines the framework before it can be formalized. On the regional side, whether the Gulf states have used the crisis window to advance alternative security arrangements that make a return to pre-conflict conditions structurally unavailable. At day 30, the most likely state of the region across all three scenarios we have identified is some version of the following. The immediate military exchange has produced significant physical damage on multiple sides without decisive strategic outcome. A fragile ceasefire framework is in place, brokered through the channels that have historically managed US-Iran de-escalation. Global oil markets are elevated but beginning to normalize as straight operations resume. The Iranian nuclear program has been set back in physical terms but not structurally interrupted. The knowledge base, the organizational capacity, and the political commitment to the program are intact. The proxy network has been degraded in specific elements but not dismantled. Hezbollah has expended significant munitions but retains organizational coherence and begins resupply planning. American domestic politics is in the post-conflict assessment period, the reckoning with what was achieved, what was not, and what it cost. American regional credibility is neither destroyed nor restored. It is in an ambiguous condition that each actor in the region is evaluating independently based on its own interests and its own reading of what the 30 days demonstrated about American strategic will and capability. The structural facts that determine the day 30 landscape are worth stating precisely. Structural fact number one is that no military campaign of 30 days duration can resolve the fundamental issues that produced the conflict. The Iranian nuclear program, the proxy network architecture, the question of Iranian regional influence, the sustainability of the American strategic position in the Middle East, none of these issues are resolved by 30 days of military exchange. They are, in some respects, sharpened. The parties have a more accurate, empirical understanding of each other's military capabilities and political thresholds than they had before the conflict. But the structural competition that produced the conflict is intact, and the diplomatic architecture required to manage it on a durable basis does not exist at day 30 in any more developed form than it existed at day 0. Structural fact number 2 is that the economic consequences of the 30-day conflict extend well beyond 30 days. Oil price spikes, supply chain disruptions, market volatility, and the fiscal cost of the military operations all produce economic effects with timelines measured in quarters and years rather than days. The American economy at day 30 is absorbing a shock whose full impact will not be visible in economic data for another 6 to 12 months. The political consequences of that economic impact on the next electoral cycle, on the domestic political coalition that supports the American strategic commitment in the Middle East, on the Federal Reserve's ability to manage inflation and growth simultaneously, are downstream consequences of the 30-day conflict that matter as much as any military outcome. Structural fact number 3 is the Chinese strategic position at day 30, which is stronger than at day 0 in ways that do not require China to have taken any military action. China has demonstrated through the ceasefire brokerage it participated in that it is an indispensable diplomatic actor in the Middle East. It has deepened the perception among Gulf states that the American-led security architecture is not the only option available. It has maintained its economic relationships in the region through a period of maximum disruption, demonstrating a reliability that American strategic unpredictability has undermined. And it has observed with extremely high-quality intelligence the specific capabilities and limitations of American and Israeli military operations, information of considerable value for its own military planning in other theaters. Structural fact number 4 is the proxy network resilience factor that Western military planning consistently underestimates. Hezbollah, the Houthis, and the Iraqi militias are not conventional military forces whose defeat is determined by the destruction of specific physical assets. They are politically embedded, organizationally resilient movements whose capacity to reconstitute after military degradation has been demonstrated repeatedly in previous conflict cycles. At day 30, the degradation the proxy network has suffered is real and meaningful. The trajectory of reconstitution, resupply from Iran, organizational rebuilding, recruitment into depleted units has already begun. The strategic significance of the network at day 30 is not its current depleted state. It is its reconstitution timeline, which Iranian strategic planning has already mapped and is already resourcing. Structural fact number 5 is the domestic political legacy of the 30-day conflict for American strategy. The specific way in which the conflict resolved, neither decisive victory nor decisive defeat, significant cost without clear strategic gain, a fragile ceasefire that does not address the fundamental issues, is precisely the kind of outcome that most damages long-term domestic political support for sustained strategic commitment. The American public's tolerance for the kind of ongoing, costly, ambiguous engagement that managing the Middle Eastern strategic competition requires is lower at day 30 than at day 0. That contraction of domestic political will is the most consequential strategic consequence of the 30-day sequence, not the physical damage to Iranian military infrastructure, not the temporary elevation of oil prices, not the diplomatic realignments. The damage to the domestic political foundation of American strategic commitment is the outcome that Iran's operational planning is most specifically designed to produce. And at day 30, by the analysis this timeline supports, that damage has been successfully inflicted. The impact on ordinary Americans across this 30-day sequence is concrete and direct. Gas prices at day 15 are the most immediate and visible economic signal. The number at the pump that translates the strategic abstraction of Middle Eastern conflict into kitchen table reality. Market volatility and retirement account values are the second signal. The portfolio statement that arrives and reflects a month of geopolitical shock. The cost of the military operations, preliminary estimates suggesting hundreds of billions of dollars for a 30-day sustained air and naval campaign at the scale this scenario requires, is the third signal, with implications for the federal fiscal position and for the domestic spending priorities that compete with defense budgets in the political process. My read on the timing question. The question this analysis is ultimately organized around. The 30-day timeline we have walked through is not a distant hypothetical. The structural conditions that would activate it, the pre-war environment, the calibrated proxy pressure, the advancing nuclear program, the degraded diplomatic architecture are present now. The specific triggering event that starts day one can take multiple forms, can occur through deliberate decision or through miscalculation, and can be initiated by multiple actors whose independent decisions could produce the threshold crossing. The probability of this timeline activating in any given 30-day window is not high. The probability of it activating in the next 12 months is considerably higher than the managed calm of the current news cycle suggests. Watch 3 specific indicators for the earliest signal that day one may be approaching. First, the tempo and scale of Israeli operations against Iranian-linked assets in Syria and Lebanon. A significant escalation in that operational tempo is the most reliable leading indicator of a decision about Iranian nuclear infrastructure having been made or being imminent. Second, the level of IRGC-directed militia activity against American assets in Iraq, an escalation to the level of mass casualty attacks rather than harassment operation signals that Iran has decided to test the American response threshold in preparation for the full activation sequence. Third, the oil futures market pricing of geopolitical risk premium, when sophisticated market participants begin pricing in conflict probability at levels significantly above the current baseline. They are incorporating intelligence and analytical inputs that are not yet visible in the public discourse. Don't follow the headline, follow the pattern. If this timeline gave you the clearest analytical map of the sequence that matters most, and that is the only standard by which this kind of work earns your time, please like this video and subscribe right now, because the story we have been mapping across this entire series is moving toward exactly the kind of inflection point that rewards analytical preparation over reactive surprise. The 30 days we walked through today are not inevitable, but they are possible in ways that the current news cycle is not adequately conveying. And being prepared for what is possible is the only rational response to a world moving at the pace this one currently is. Headlines end, consequences don't. Stay analytical.